You've watched them, haven't you? The naturally gifted ones, the people who seem to have been born with something you don't have. They pick things up faster. They understand concepts that take you hours to grasp in what seems like minutes. They make it look easy while you're grinding through the basics, wondering why everything feels so much harder for you. And there's this particular kind of pain that comes with that, isn't there? Not just envy, though that's part of it, but something deeper, this quiet despair that maybe you just don't have what it takes, that maybe you missed the genetic lottery, that maybe some people are simply born to excel and you're not one of them. You've worked hard, you've put in effort, but you keep running into your ceiling while watching talented people float past you with what looks like minimal effort. And underneath all of that is this question that won't quite leave you alone. What's the point? What's the point of trying when you're starting from so far behind? What's the point of practicing when someone else can do in a day what takes you a week? What's the point of persisting when talent seems to be the only thing that really matters? And maybe you've even started to give up, not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly. A quiet resignation that you're just not meant for this, that you should probably focus on something more realistic, something that matches your limited abilities, something that doesn't require you to compete with people who have what you don't. But what if everything you believe about talent is wrong? What if the story you've been telling yourself about why talented people win and why you can't is actually backwards? What if talent, the thing you think is the ultimate advantage, is actually a trap? And what if consistency, the thing that seems so boring and unglamorous, the thing that talented people often skip right past, is actually the only thing that matters in the long run? What if the race isn't won by the swift, but by the steady? What if the hare really does lose to the tortoise, not in fairy tales, but in actual life, over and over again, and you just haven't been watching long enough to see it happen? Because here's what nobody tells you when they're celebrating natural talent. Talent gets you started fast, but it doesn't get you to the finish line. Talent makes the beginning easy, but it doesn't prepare you for the middle. Talent creates early success, but it doesn't build the character required to handle failure. And consistency, slow, unglamorous, unimpressive consistency, that's what actually builds mastery. That's what actually creates results that last. That's what separates people who flash briefly and fade from people who stay and compound and ultimately become undeniable. Let me stay with this for a while, because this isn't just a motivational platitude. This is about understanding something fundamental about how growth actually works, about how mastery is actually built, and about why the advantages you think matter don't matter nearly as much as you've been told. Think about water for a moment. Water isn't strong. You can put your hand through it. You can splash it around. It seems weak, yielding, powerless. But water, given enough time, given enough consistent presence, carves through stone. Not through force, not through intensity, through persistence, through showing up in the same place, touching the same spot again and again and again, until the stone that seemed permanent has a canyon running through it. The stone doesn't give way in a day. It doesn't surrender in a month. But the water doesn't stop. It doesn't get bored. It doesn't wonder if it has enough talent to erode stone. It just keeps flowing. And eventually, inevitably, the stone yields. Not to power, but to consistency. Not to talent, but to presence. That's the pattern. That's how the world actually works when you watch it long enough. Consistency beats everything given. Sufficient time. And time is the one resource that everyone has access to equally. The talented and the untalented, the gifted and the average. Everyone gets the same 24 hours. Everyone gets the same years. And what you do with those hours, what you do with those years, that determines everything. Now let's talk about what happens to talented people that nobody wants to admit. Talent creates a particular kind of problem. When things come easily to you, when you're praised for your natural abilities, When you achieve success early without having to struggle much, something happens to your relationship with difficulty. You start to believe that if something is hard, it means you're not good at it. You start to think that struggle is evidence of inadequacy, because up until now, the things you were good at didn't require struggle. They came naturally. So when you finally encounter something that doesn't come naturally, something that requires real effort and persistence and repeated failure, you don't have the tools to handle it. You've never had to develop those tools. You've never had to learn how to push through when you're not immediately good at something. You've never had to build the tolerance for being bad at something long enough to get good at it. And so you quit, not because you can't do it, but because it feels wrong. It feels like you've hit your limit. It feels like this must not be your thing. And you move on to something else, something where your talent gives you that early advantage again, that immediate feedback that you're special, that you're gifted, that you're one of the chosen ones. But the person without natural talent, the person who's had to work for every inch of progress, they have a completely different relationship with difficulty. For them, difficulty is normal. Struggle is expected. Being bad at something doesn't mean anything except that they're learning. They've never had the luxury of things coming easily, so they've developed something more valuable than talent. They've developed persistence. They've developed the capacity to show up when they're not good yet, to keep practicing when progress is invisible, to continue even when there's no external validation, no praise, no recognition, because they're not doing it to feel special. They're doing it because they decided to do it. And that decision, that commitment, that's more powerful than any natural ability, because talent runs out. Talent hits ceilings. Talent encounters things it can't easily master and doesn't know what to do. But consistency doesn't run out. Consistency doesn't hit ceilings. Consistency just keeps going. And given enough time, consistency compounds into something that looks like talent, but is actually something more durable, something that was earned rather than given. Let me give you an example. Imagine two people who want to become writers. One has natural talent. Beautiful prose comes easily to them. Their first attempts are praised. People tell them they're gifted. They should definitely pursue this. The other person struggles. Their early writing is clumsy. Nobody praises it. They have to work hard just to write a coherent sentence. Now fast forward 5 years. The talented person has written maybe 10 things, beautiful things, but only 10. Because they only write when inspiration strikes, when they feel that natural flow, when the words come easily. And because they're talented, the words do come easily sometimes, but not consistently. And they've never developed the discipline to write when it's hard, so they wait. They wait for the muse. They wait for the feeling. They wait for that effortless state where their talent can shine. Meanwhile, the untalented person has written every single day for 5 years. Not always well, often badly, but consistently. And here's what happens with that kind of consistency. You get better. Not through magic, not through sudden downloads of talent, but through the simple mathematics of repetition. You make mistakes and you learn from them. You try things, and some of them work. You read what you wrote yesterday and you see what's wrong with it, and you don't make that mistake today. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, your baseline rises. Your floor gets higher. And after 5 years of daily practice, of consistent engagement, the untalented person isn't untalented anymore. They've built skills through sheer repetition that the talented person never needed to build because things came easily. And now, in year 6, something interesting happens. The talented person who only writes when inspired produces maybe 2 pieces that year. Beautiful pieces because they still have that natural gift. But the consistent person produces 300 pieces, and even if only 10% of them are good, that's 30 good pieces. That's 30 pieces to choose from, to publish, to share, to build a body of work from. And the talented person has 2, so who wins? Who actually builds the career? Who actually becomes the writer? This pattern repeats everywhere. In every field, in every domain, the talented people flame bright early and then stagnate or burn out or lose interest. And the consistent people just keep showing up, keep practicing, keep iterating. And slowly, the gap closes, then reverses. And eventually, the consistent person laps the talented person because the talented person stopped running. They're back at the starting line waiting to feel like running again, waiting for that natural ease to return. But the consistent person never stopped. They ran when it was hard. They ran when they were tired. They ran when nobody was watching and nobody cared. They ran because they said they would run. And that's the difference. That's the whole game. Talent is a head start. Consistency is the race. And the race is long. Longer than most people realize. Long enough that the head start stops mattering. Long enough that what matters is who's still running. Now let's go deeper into why this is. Let's talk about what consistency actually builds that talent doesn't. When you do something consistently, when you show up to it day after day, regardless of how you feel or how it's going, you're not just practicing that skill. You're building something more fundamental. You're building identity. You're building the person who does this thing. Not the person who's good at this thing, but the person who shows up for this thing. And that's a completely different identity. The talented person identifies as someone who's good at it. Their identity is tied to the outcome, to the quality, to the recognition. So when those things aren't present, when they're struggling, or the work isn't being praised, or they're not immediately excellent, their identity is threatened. They start to question whether they should be doing this at all. But the consistent person identifies as someone who shows up. Their identity isn't tied to being good. It's tied to being present, to being someone who keeps their word to themselves, to being someone who said they would do this and then did it. And that identity is unshakable because it doesn't depend on external validation. It doesn't depend on results. It depends on one thing: showing up. And you can always control showing up. You can't always control how well you perform. You can't control whether people like what you create. You can't control whether you're having a good day or a bad day. But you can control whether you're there, whether you engaged, whether you tried. And when your identity is built on that, when that's what makes you who you are, then nothing can take it away from you. You're a writer because you write, not because you write well, not because you're published. Because you write. You're an athlete because you train, not because you win, not because you're talented, because you train. That's identity. And it's built through consistency, not talent. And here's what that identity gives you: freedom. Freedom from the need to be special. Freedom from the pressure to be immediately good. Freedom from the comparison game where you're constantly measuring yourself against others. Because you're not trying to be the best. You're not trying to be better than anyone. You're just trying to be someone who shows up. And that's achievable. That's completely within your control. And once you have that identity, once you know yourself as someone who's consistent, everything else becomes easier. Not because the work gets easier, but because you're not carrying the extra weight of needing it to mean something about your worth. You're not using your performance as evidence of whether you're good enough. You're just doing the work because you're the kind of person who does this work. And that's liberating. That's the freedom that consistency gives you, the freedom to show up without the burden of needing to be impressive, without the burden of needing to justify your existence through your talent. You just show up. And in that showing up day after day, month after month, year after year, you become someone who can't be stopped. Not because you're talented, but because you're relentless. Not because you're gifted, but because you're committed. And commitment beats talent every single time when the timeline is long enough. Now, I want to address something that might be coming up for you. You might be thinking, but what if I'm consistent and I still don't get good? What if I show up every day and I practice and I try and I still never reach the level of the naturally talented people? And that's a real question, a fair question. And here's the truth, you might not. You might never be as good as someone with natural talent who also has consistency. If you're competing against someone who has both the gift and the discipline, you might always be second best. But that's not the point. The point isn't to beat everyone. The point is to become what you can become, to express what's in you, to develop your capacity to the fullest extent possible, given what you were given. And consistency does that. Consistency takes whatever raw material you have and refines it to its highest form. It doesn't make you someone else. It makes you the most complete version of yourself. And that's enough. That's always been enough. You don't need to be the best in the world. You just need to be fully yourself, fully realized, fully expressed. And that only comes through consistent engagement over time, through showing up to your own development, through honoring your own potential even when it's not as impressive as someone else's potential. Your potential is still yours, and it deserves to be fulfilled. Not so you can compete with others, but so you can know what you're capable of. So you can look back and say, I gave it everything. I showed up, I didn't quit. I became everything I could become given what I had to work with. And that's victory. Not victory over others, but victory over the part of yourself that wanted to quit because it wasn't easy, because you weren't naturally gifted, because it seemed hopeless. Let's talk about what happens in the brain with consistency, because this isn't just philosophy. This is neuroscience. When you do something repeatedly, when you practice consistently, you're literally rewiring your brain. You're building neural pathways. You're making connections. You're automating processes that used to require conscious effort. And the beautiful thing about neuroplasticity, about the brain's ability to change, is that it doesn't care about talent. It doesn't care if you started with a head start or not. It just responds to repetition, to use, to engagement. The brain optimizes for whatever you do consistently. If you consistently scroll social media, your brain gets really good at craving that dopamine hit and finding ways to return to scrolling. If you consistently practice a skill, your brain gets really good at that skill. It's mechanical. It's automatic. You're not trying to force the brain to change. You're just using it consistently in a particular way. And it changes itself. And over time, what used to be hard becomes easy. Not because you got more talented, but because your brain built the infrastructure to support that activity. You've paved the neural highways. You've optimized the pathways. And now what used to require enormous effort and concentration happens with much less. That's what consistency builds at a biological level. Capability, capacity, ease. Not through talent, but through repetition. And the talented person who doesn't practice consistently, their brain isn't building those pathways. They might have a head start, some natural wiring that makes certain things easier, but without consistent use, that wiring doesn't develop, it doesn't deepen, it doesn't become automatic. They stay at the level of their natural talent and they never move beyond it. They never build the infrastructure that would take them from talented beginner to absolute master, because mastery requires tens of thousands of hours of consistent practice. There's no shortcut. There's no amount of talent that lets you skip the time. You can't compress the development. You can't rush the neuroplasticity. You have to put in the hours. And if you're not consistent, you don't put in the hours. You put in scattered days here and there. And scattered practice doesn't build neural pathways the same way. It doesn't create the same level of optimization. You're always starting over. Always relearning, always fighting through the awkward stage because you never stay in it long enough to move through it. But the consistent person, even without natural talent, puts in the hours. And the hours do their work. The brain does its work. And slowly, inevitably, they become capable in ways the inconsistently talented person never does. Now let's explore the emotional dimension of this. Because consistency does something to your emotional state that talent doesn't. When you're consistent, when you show up regardless of how you feel, you start to decouple your actions from your emotions. You learn that you don't have to feel motivated to do the thing. You don't have to feel inspired. You don't have to feel good. You just do it anyway. And that's an incredibly powerful realization, because most people are completely controlled by their emotions. They only do things when they feel like it, when the mood strikes, when they have energy. And that means they're at the mercy of their internal weather. Some days they feel great and they accomplish a lot. Other days they feel terrible and they accomplish nothing. Their output is completely inconsistent because it's tied to their emotional state. But the person who's learned consistency, who's practiced showing up regardless of how they feel, they've broken that connection. They've learned that emotions are just weather. They come and they go. Sometimes it's sunny inside and sometimes it's stormy. But the work isn't dependent on the weather. The work happens anyway. And that gives you a stability that talented people who rely on feeling inspired or motivated never have. You're not waiting for the right mood. You're not at the mercy of your fluctuating emotional state. You just show up. And some days it's easy and some days it's hard, but you're there either way. And that reliability, that steadiness, that's what produces results over time. Not the brilliant performances on good days, but the adequate efforts on bad days. The willingness to keep going when you don't feel like it, when it's not fun, when there's no immediate reward. That's what builds something real. And here's what's paradoxical about this. By decoupling your actions from your emotions, by learning to show up regardless of how you feel, you actually stabilize your emotions. Because you're no longer in this feedback loop where you feel bad, so you don't do the thing, and then you feel worse because you didn't do the thing, and then you feel even worse and you still don't do the thing. That spiral of guilt and shame and paralysis, it breaks when you just do the thing anyway. When you say, I feel terrible, but I'm showing up. I don't want to do this, but I'm doing it. And once you start, once you actually engage, the feeling shifts. The resistance dissolves. The motivation shows up after you begin, not before. But you had to begin first. You had to show up without waiting for the feeling. And the consistent person learns this. They learn that motivation is a result of action, not a prerequisite for it. And that completely changes the game. Because now they're not stuck waiting to feel like it. They just act. And the feeling follows. And even when it doesn't, even when the whole session feels like pulling teeth, they did it. They kept their word to themselves. They maintained the streak. They reinforced the identity. And that's valuable even when the work itself wasn't great, because they're building the muscle of consistency. And that muscle is more valuable than any single piece of work. Let's talk about what consistency looks like over decades, because this is where the real magic happens. In the short term, talent looks better. The talented person produces better work with less effort. They win the early contests. They get the early recognition. They seem like they're on a path to greatness. But watch what happens over 10 years, over 20 years, over a lifetime. The consistent person has been showing up every day or most days for all those years. They've accumulated 10,000 hours, 20,000 hours, 50,000 hours. And all those hours have compounded. Their skills have deepened. Their understanding has broadened. Their capacity has grown. They're not the same person they were at the beginning. They've been transformed by the practice. They've become someone who's genuinely masterful, not because they were born with it, but because they built it brick by brick, day by day, through unglamorous, consistent effort. Meanwhile, the talented person, if they never developed consistency, is still basically where they were at the beginning. Maybe a little better, maybe a little more polished, but not transformed, not deepened. Because transformation requires time and engagement, and they never gave it enough of either. They dabbled, they visited, they showed up when it was easy. But they didn't live there, they didn't make it their home. And so they never discovered what was on the other side of the difficulty. They never pushed through to the place where the practice stops being something you do and becomes something you are. Where it stops being an effort and becomes an expression. Where it stops being work and becomes flow. And this is what consistency ultimately creates: flow. Not the temporary state where you feel good and everything is easy, but flow as a way of being, as a natural expression of who you've become through practice. When you've done something 10,000 times, it stops being something you think about. It becomes automatic, natural. It flows through you without resistance, and that's mastery. That's what everyone who's truly great has developed. Not talent, though they might have had talent too, but consistency over time until the practice becomes part of them, until they are the practice. And you can see it when you watch them work. There's an ease, an inevitability. It looks like talent, but it's actually 10,000 days of showing up. 10,000 days of practice, 10,000 days of consistency, compounded into something that looks effortless. And that's available to anyone, to the talented and the untalented, to the gifted and the average. Anyone who's willing to show up for long enough will eventually arrive at that place, will eventually develop that flow. But most people aren't willing. Most people quit long before they get there. They quit when it's hard. They quit when they're not immediately good. They quit when the talented people lap them in year 2. They don't stay long enough to see what happens in year 10 or year 20, when consistency has done its work and they've transformed into someone capable of things they couldn't imagine at the beginning. So the question isn't whether you have talent. The question is whether you have commitment, whether you can commit to showing up even when you're not immediately good. Even when progress is slow, even when nobody is watching or caring, whether you can commit to the practice for its own sake, not for what it will get you, but because it's what you've decided to do, because you've chosen this. And that choice, renewed daily, creates everything. It creates skills, it creates identity, it creates confidence, it creates results, not overnight. Not in a way that looks impressive to people who are watching from the outside, but steadily, reliably, inevitably. And one day you look up and you realize you're not the person you were when you started. You're someone who's capable, someone who's developed, someone who's earned their place through sheer persistence. And that feeling, that knowing that you built this yourself through consistency, that's more satisfying than any natural talent could ever be. Because you didn't get lucky, you didn't get given something, you earned it, you showed up for it. You stayed with it when it was hard, and now it's yours. Not as a gift, but as something you forged through the daily practice of showing up. If these words are reaching you, if something in this reflection is touching something you've been struggling with, I want to invite you to acknowledge that. To mark this moment. You can do that by liking this video, not for the algorithm, though that helps too, but as a gesture to yourself, as a way of saying, yes, this matters. I heard something here that I needed to hear. I'm ready to stop waiting for talent and start trusting consistency. And if you want to continue exploring these ideas, if you want more reflections on how to build a life through steady practice rather than sporadic brilliance, consider subscribing to this channel. This space exists for people who are done with quick fixes and overnight success fantasies, who understand that real transformation is slow, that mastery is built through repetition, that the only thing that matters in the long run is whether you keep showing up. If that's you, you're welcome here. Your journey matters, your consistency matters, and your willingness to keep going when you're not the most talented person in the room, that matters more than you know. As we come to the end of this exploration, I want to leave you with something to hold on to. You don't need to be talented. You really don't. Talent is nice. It's a head start. It makes things easier at the beginning, but it's not required. What's required is the willingness to show up, to practice when you're not good yet, to continue when progress is invisible, to trust that consistency, boring, unglamorous consistency, will take you further than any natural gift ever could. Because here's the truth that nobody wants to say out loud. Most talented people waste their talent. They squander it. They take it for granted. They assume it will always be there, always be enough. And they never develop the discipline to actually maximize it. So they end up as people who could have been great but weren't. People with potential that was never fulfilled. And that's tragic. But you don't have to be tragic. You don't have to be the person with the most potential. You can be the person who does the most with whatever potential you have. You can be the person who shows up, who practices, who improves steadily over time, who builds skills through repetition, who develops mastery through consistency. And 10 years from now, 20 years from now, you'll be someone that people look at and think they must be talented. They must have been born with something special. And you'll know the truth. You'll know that there was nothing special about the beginning. There was just someone who decided to show up and kept deciding every day for years. And the years did their work. Consistency did its work. And here you are, not because you were gifted, because you were committed. And commitment beats talent every time, in the long run, always. Welcome to the long run. Welcome to the practice. Welcome to discovering what you become when you stop waiting for talent and start trusting consistency. You're going to surprise yourself. Not tomorrow, not next week, but eventually, inevitably, if you just keep showing up. That's the only requirement. That's the whole game. Show up, keep showing up, and watch what happens when you do.